I'm Dean Wise, and I'm here to share with you some perspectives on new proximity focused on the mobility of people and stuff. My background is in transportation and logistics, career of over 40 years, mostly on the business side of transportation, both passenger and freight, and want to share with you some insights of what's been happening in the past, what's over the horizon, and how should we be thinking about some of the new developments in the framework with some new frameworks about new proximity and some new vocabulary. So let me continue. So space-time compression, that's the phrase that we talk about a lot. And it comes from both the innovations in communications and also in transportation. As I mentioned, I'm really focusing on the transportation side, the physical movement of people and stuff. So that's travel and trade. And just to put a point on it, a very quotable phrase, which comes from Karl Marx, is that humankind has really pursued a relentless quest to annihilate time and space, annihilate. Now, Karl Marx said that in 1858, observing the impact of railroads. It's hard to believe what goes beyond annihilate if he were to be here today with us. And as you'll see, the annihilation will continue as we go forward. So we've seen, in fact, it took millions of years for our species to evolve, but really only a few hundred years to shrink the world. Certainly we had some innovation before that, but it's really been the last 200 years where we've seen this acceleration of primarily speed. We talk about speed, and I want to get away from speed a little bit, which I think will be important nuance for us as we go forward. But in fact, the first new proximity actually probably came before Homo sapiens. People suspect that Homo erectus actually jumped on a raft, whether inadvertent or not, and floated to across continents and so forth. That sort of spurred migration, of course. But we can really say this isn't new. There were two very big innovations, which came from human ingenuity 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. Number one was the domestication of the horse 6,000 years ago, and that was in Kazakhstan. And of course, that led to not just people, but also goods moving. And then sailboats. So sailboats were really pioneered on the Nile, Indus Valley, and in the Tigris Euphrates. And we had whole civilizations that basically created a very strong regional trade. For example, the Phoenicians and the whole Mediterranean. So we had big pockets of pretty ample interaction and trade between people and their goods on a regional level. But it really wasn't, we really can't say that that became global until the explorer, age of exploration with the bigger ships. And just a note, Magellan actually circumnavigated 501 years ago. So that really the beginning of globalization? You decide. But it's really been since then with the massive jump in speed from steamboats, steam locomotives, rail, of course, the automobile, airplane, prop planes, jet planes, and even into space travel. So we really accelerated this whole new proximity annihilation in the last 200 years. And that's where we wring our hands in angst and try to figure it out. So we'll keep wringing our hands, but let's look out ahead and say, what's the next thing? This doesn't stop. It's about human ingenuity. And over the horizon, I'm just going to pick off a few examples from what's known. We can't possibly imagine what's going to be out there 50 years from now, but over the next 20 years, here's a little windshield tour of the gee whiz. So already happening, robo-taxis on the left, autonomous shuttles on the right. A robo-taxi is sensors and software on an existing car. Waymo is pioneering it. It's happening today in cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas and San Francisco. And there are 25 companies creating these autonomous shuttles, which are purpose-built vehicles to maximize the load factor for comfortable shared vehicles. You don't see a steering wheel or a driver's seat in this, and that's happening. Autonomous trucking, again, take the driver out. This is what it might look like some years away, but this is happening now with driverless trucks today. There's one company called Gatik, which is working with Walmart, truly driverless today. and there's several other companies that will basically still have cabs. It'll be diesel and or electric trucks, driverless in 2024. This has got massive implications, not just for trucking, but also for the competition from railroads as well. Railroads can still move ahead with automation. They can certainly automate trains, which is the first thing that comes to mind. Just take the drivers out of the cab, and that's basically, we see that in some transit agencies that have no drivers or one driver. But if you think really out of the box, if we don't have to have a train, we could do we don't have to spread those costs of the crew, et cetera. We could actually have a self-propelled rail vehicle. Parallel Systems is one of several that are doing this. They're probably the lead, and this has very big implications for improving the position of rail, making it more effective, more cost-effective in shorter distance moves, compete with truck, and of course the frequency can be truck-like as opposed to waiting till you have enough volume for a train. So stay tuned for autonomous rail freight. Hyperloop. Well, the name says it. It's been a lot of hype. This is basically a maglev in a semi-vacuum tube, basically firing packets of people or goods every several minutes. And the theory is 700 miles an hour. Equally impressive is the capacity that you could put through a single pipe like this when you're basically firing packets or pods, let's say, every several minutes. The capacity is horrendous. The negative is it's super intensive, capital intensive, and to get that speed, you have to have a very nice alignment. You don't want to have too many curves like this and too much up and down, or you won't have any passengers that are alive at the end. And even the freight has a problem. And freight, frankly, doesn't need 700 miles an hour. So I would say Hyperloop. Stay tuned. There'll be some developments, but not. It's not going to take over the world. Drone parcel delivery was Jeff Bezos predicted 10 years ago, 2003, that Amazon would be having deliveries by drones in 5 years by 2018. Not happened by Amazon, but others are doing it. So 10 years later, we actually have Walmart is probably the lead, and this is happening today. A lot of interest in humanitarian, medical supplies, human organ transplant, et cetera, but also some very selective markets where there's deliveries into of goods into stores or even into homes. Lots of friction issues with this, but it's happening. Similarly, take this into a passenger mode, bigger vehicle. This is can be start with a driver or a pilot in it, but then could go driverless. But the air mobility future is basically going to be quieter and safer with electric VTOLs, vertical takeoff and landings, that will take off and land from the tops of buildings and other vertiports. It's happening. There's lots of manufacturers out there. We'll see some of this happen in the next couple of years. Supersonic jets. Well, we had the Concorde for about 20 years. Last Concorde was actually 20 years ago, 2003. Failed because of noise issues and cost issues. And but there's the new designs, and there's several manufacturers and a lot of support from NASA, will basically bring this back probably by 2030. So we'll have much quieter and much more efficient supersonic. What does that do? It basically takes a 7-hour trip from London to New York down to about 3.5 hours. So lots of speed value with supersonic jets, of course. And then moving really further up the speed curve is now that we have reusable rockets, we can start to contemplate punching into the suborbital atmosphere. And the mission statement from DoD is move 100 tons, which is the same volume you can get into a C-130 cargo plane, to any point on Earth in 1 hour. And this is actually I wouldn't say it's real, but they want to focus on humanitarian and then emergency troop deployment, et cetera. And there's some big money that's already been designated for R&D with SpaceX to develop rocket cargo. But don't hold your breath. It's going to be a while, and it's not going to be for everybody. And just to remind ourselves, it's not all about human innovation. Mother Nature plays a role. And I would say it's pretty good prediction that within the century, maybe 40 years from now, we will have a clear passage through the Northwest Passage year round. Today, it's seasonal, and there's really only about 30 or 40 vessels that pass through here every year. but in some years from now, you'll be able to go from Europe to Asia with 40% less miles and several weeks less time. So that's a game changer, massive implications for the whole global supply chains and how it will affect the West Coast US ports, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, if you're young, this could happen in your lifetime. So that's just a quick smattering of what's coming. We could imagine much more, you might imagine much more, and we should. That's part of what we want to do here with New Proximity. But to really get our hands around it, we need a better framework. I keep saying speed and automation. That's the stuff of popular mechanics, which we love to read. But there's much more nuance that we need to bring into our discussion about New Proximity and how it's going to affect us. Basically, I start with this, where I have several driving forces. These are basically driven by interest from both public benefits and private benefits. Safety, of course, reducing GHG, a lot of that with electrification, automation to reduce costs and improve safety, virtualization, which is really a substitute for the physical, and then some of the socio-political aspects, which may be driving both positive and negative. But then we can assess those forces in terms of what the new technologies come along, et cetera, in terms of the change in speed, the change in distance, the delay, and then that adds up to the time, the transit time when you take those first three. And then, okay, given that, what's how it may be attractive, but what's it cost and what kind of capacity do we have? Certainly a rocket cargo is not going to have a lot of capacity to move the amount of cargo we move around the world today by ocean. And then supply chain, very interesting how supply chains can affect this whole impact. And last but not least is access, which is a combination of who actually gets to use it. It's the people, but it's also the frequency. How familiar do you get? We're all familiar with Amazon, or most of us are. And that is an important aspect of New Proximity, is how comfortable we get with it. So here's the same list of what I call the dimensions. Speed, I think we're always looking at faster, but we can go slower for sure. So one thing, because of higher fuel costs, is slow steaming. Ocean vessels are actually slowing down to save fuel. Takes them a little bit longer. Distance, we all know from Googling our Google Maps that we can go shortest practical possible, and distance is variable. It actually has shortened over time in many cases and can lengthen. I'll tell you why. Delay is very important. Time, of course, the result, etc. So let me show you that another kind of takeaway is each of these dimensions is dynamic, as I said, and it may change every day. It may change over time, like a new supply chain, but even distance is variable. When we get in an airplane, we go pretty direct compared to what we can do in a car or a truck or a highway vehicle or a train. Trains actually have quite a bit of circuity because of the route. So there's circuity, and we bust through that circuity with things like Panama Canal, Suez Canal, with tunnels and bridges, et cetera. So we have to think of these as all moving targets. The other aspect of it is not only are they dynamic, they interact. So a system dynamics view, which is a big mouthful, but there's tools to get really interesting analysis out of these 7 dimensions. So there's the 7 dimensions around the wheel. And we need to kind of go through a process of looking at, for every operating domain, every mode of transport, every new initiative, what does this look like? What's the differential? What's the change that happens? That leads to a very intriguing conversation, I believe. And I went through this myself. So here's some simple observations, just looking at these frameworks and saying, what do I take away just from my very first pass? And I want to do more of this with you. But certainly technology tends to increase vehicle speed, but there's always friction to slow it down. Distances are not fixed. They can shorten with new infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, canals, and they can lengthen when the infrastructure fails. So we had a failure of the interstate highway system in Philadelphia. Fortunately, it was an amazing 12-day fix, but that lengthened journey time and distance. And of course, Mother Nature can change it. That's the Northwest Passage. Delays increase with higher demand. I want to point out one very, very important delay change. So trucks today actually can't run 24/7. The driver has to rest for 8 hours. So if we automate the trucks, we can go from 11 hours driving time today with a human driver to 20 hours driving time. That cuts 8 hours a day. That halves the transit time, which makes the effective speed. We're not going any faster. We're still going 65, 55, but the effective speed, because we're going more 24/7, is going to really change the competitive dynamics with truck freight and rail intermodal. Electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles can lower the variable costs. They definitely will. As you may know, if you have an electric car, your fuel cost can be a third the cost of gasoline. And when we lower variable costs, we actually increase demand. But as we increase demand, that creates congestion and maybe dispersion. So these are some unintended consequences we have to be careful of. Again, the system dynamics is very important. And since we generally have low variable costs, we're actually paying high fixed costs, at least today. Those are going down for EVs, but that can reduce access just to be able to get into your own electric vehicle. Supply chains are shortening. Big examples here, microbreweries. We see those today. We enjoy them. But precision fermentation, cellular proteins, other forms of localization, locavore of food, that could really change supply chains, shorten them quite a bit. 3D printing, same thing, when the supply moves closer to the demand. And last but not least, as virtualization proceeds from Zoom to metaverse, and metaverse looks almost like we're there, and with not just visual and sound, but ultimately with the other senses, will those immersive experiences actually curtail demand for in-person travel? So this is just the starting point. I'd love to get into some more conversations, see what you think about the frameworks, and get into more dialogue on the whole topic of mobility and new proximity. Last but not least, the very end game, it's all about convergence. Thank you.